Thank you for joining us today. Our presentation is entitled BLM, Community Activism, and Digital Archiving in the Era of George Floyd. Organic intellectual, Black Lives Matter activist, and citizen archivist are not labels 25-year-old Wanja Kuria identified with before May 25th, 2020. Seeing the 8-minute, 46-second video of 47-year-old George Floyd's murder at the hands of Minneapolis police officers horrified and angered her. Another unarmed Black man killed by white police officers. Floyd's death was a deeply personal and emotional loss for millions of people around the world. But for Wanja, the murder was especially haunting. The intersection of Chicago Avenue and 38th Street is just 8 minutes from where she resides in Minneapolis. Houston's 3rd Ward, Floyd's childhood neighborhood, is a mere 30 minutes from where Wanja went to high school. Like so many of us, Kuria immediately took to the streets to protest Floyd's death. Armed with her face mask, iPhone XR, and the homemade sign reading Black Lives Matter, Kuria and friends walked to East 38th Street and Chicago Avenue. Amongst the crowd of protesters and while fighting back tears, Kuria took a few photos of the artwork and flowers brought to the square to memorialize Floyd. What started as a visit to the weekend protest rally and impromptu photo shoot of the memorial soon developed into the Justice for All MPLS archival collection of Black Lives Matter protests in Minneapolis. This presentation examines Wanja Kuria's activism and participation in grassroots anti-racist social movements, including Black Lives Matter, in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It uncovers the everyday experiences of Kuria and other local protesters who organized and marched immediately after the killing of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020. Kuria's work captures the intersectional protest community, their collaborative efforts, and strategic problem solving that is happening daily in Minneapolis. As you will see in a few minutes, the images that comprise the primary archive focus on the activism within George Floyd Square. And so here you'll actually see where the square is located. East 38th and Chicago Avenue, the intersection in which Floyd was murdered, and where many of Kuria's archive derives from, is situated between 4 Minneapolis neighborhoods. Cup Foods, the establishment that George Floyd took his last breath in front of, is in the furthest southwestern corner of the Powerhorn Park neighborhood. Since Floyd's death, the intersection has transformed into a memorial space, community gathering and organizing site, and a healing place, as well as an occupied territory, all of which operate at times simultaneously. Within the protest space, the aesthetic of protest can be even more evident as you enter the square. Scholar Simon Faulkner writes that the aesthetics of protest Simon Faulkner writes in The Aesthetics of Protest, his article entitled Photography and Protest in Israel-Palestine, the Active Stills Online Archive, that the aesthetics of protest is understood to encompass those aspects of protest that relate strongly to the senses, especially vision. This encompasses the ways that protested bodies assemble within space, the ways in which they interact and move, how they dress, and the performances that they enact. This immediate aesthetics of protest also entails the things that protesters carry: banners, place cards, three-dimensional props, and images, including photographs. And this image is actually from the Israeli-Palestine border, and you'll notice that they make reference to Floyd. For GFS, or George Floyd Square, a large handmade sign on plyboard in red and black letters reads, "You are now entering the free state of George Floyd." Kuria's archive has already surpassed 1,000 photographs, videos, documents, and audio files. She has systematically collected artifacts that exemplify the grassroots protest culture of Minneapolis during the George Floyd era. Since Floyd's death, the intersection has transformed into that memorial space, that community gathering site, as well as that healing space. And so what we're going to see now from Kuria's activism is that we're gonna have a community that's seeking what's called transformative justice. Let me skim down a little bit. Heba Farag speaks in The Spirit in Black Lives Matter, New Spiritual Community in Black Radical Organizing, that transformative justice is an abolitionist philosophic approach to peacemaking and community accountability. It perceives harm within a continuum of experience, offense as an opportunity for education, and a crime as a community problem to be solved through understanding. A community seeking transformative justice, therefore, would not rely on the state or its institutions to correct community problems, and would instead intentionally nurture spaces that condemn state-sanctioned and vigilante violence. Transformative justice activists then, and further archivists, pursue spaces in which healing, resiliency, and accountability are championed. An archive that is rooted in transformative justice framework must be and remain community-driven, developed, and managed, precisely because any state institutional involvement would be counterintuitive to the transformative justice initiatives situated at the grassroots level. To learn more, I now turn to Ms. Wanja Kuria to relay her experiences within the movement to you.
Thank you, Portia. Prior to May 26th, I had never participated in a protest. In so many ways, I was disconnected to myself and my Black identity in a way that made it impossible for me to be involved with any BLM-affiliated groups. It took a radical shift in my own life and the deconstruction of internalized racism and white supremacy, an ongoing work, for me to see myself as part of a collective and not just an individual unaffected by systematic racism. That journey is a separate story. Today, I would like to speak to you about my experiences in community archiving. In the beginning, I didn't see what I was doing as archiving. I would have described it as bearing witness. Everyone was recording, especially at the beginning, because we could all feel the significance of this case and the momentum it was creating around the world. We saw ourselves becoming a part of civil rights history. Of course, everyone was going to be taking videos. The shift for me happened when I realized that big broadcasting networks like CNN and Fox, and even more liberal ones like the New York Times and NPR, weren't capturing the beautiful expressions of solidarity and community I witnessed every day. Indigenous dancers who marched and rallied alongside us and shared their culture with us, marshals putting their bodies on the line to protect us when we marched and protested, medics handing out masks, water, and snacks, musicians and spoken word artists sharing their songs and reflections. These things happened at almost every protest. They were commonplace for those of us who were part of that culture, yet they're rarely, if ever, represented in footage. I felt that it was important to document and share these moments so they weren't excluded from the larger narrative. In addition, some of the broadcasting networks have contributed to the spread of misinformation by continuing to circulate the police narratives about the murders of Black and brown folks here in Minnesota. That's why independent media is so important. By following local journalists, many of whom are BIPOC, you're able to hear the families' accounts, which are almost never represented. But I soon discovered that archiving wasn't as simple as I might have imagined. As the amount of footage I documented amassed, so did the responsibility I felt to steward that honorably. I found myself in ethical dilemmas. Are my motives pure? Is it honest to edit words that may be perceived as incendiary without context? What would it mean to honor a person's agency? Does every video need to be contextualized, or am I overthinking? Am I putting people in danger if I choose to share documented footage of rioting and looting? What is my voice and who is my audience? I also faced logistical challenges, navigating availability with a 9-to-5 job, lack of experience and knowledge in documenting, a shortage in available space on my phone and my computer, financial strain, guilt for not being involved in volunteering at encampments for unhoused community members, physical and emotional fatigue from the sheer number of cases, especially locally, that exist. My hope is that what you see here today will spur you on to support local independent journalists with your viewership, financial contributions, and by circulating the videos and photos in your spheres of influence. That exposure may just be the pressure needed to reopen these families' cases and bring about justice for their loved ones. My journey into protest began on 38th in Chicago, also known as George Floyd Square. In many ways, GFS encapsulates the culture of this movement. GFS is an autonomous zone, which means it has been reclaimed by the people as a held space. Since May 26th, the day after George Floyd was murdered, GFS has been blocked off by barricades and created into a memorial space. Cars can only enter if a community member who is on guard moves the barricade for them, which rarely happens. As you can imagine, this has been a point of contention between City Council and protesters. We'll get to that later. George Floyd Square is many things. It is best known as a memorial space. Many of the pictures you've probably seen have been pictures of candles, flowers, cards, art, and mementos people have left behind in George's honor. There are also a number of sculptures and murals. GFS is also a place where people go to be fed. Twin Cities Stand Together is a local organization that formed in the wake of George Floyd's murder. It is one of several groups that feeds the community both at protests and at various points throughout the week. The square is a community space that hosts youth open mic nights, karaoke, Sunday church services, healing circles, and many other events. I went to an open mic night a few weeks ago to support my friends who were performing spoken word pieces. We had tacos and comfort food, all free thanks to community feeding. Danced to the electric slide and the wobble, watched as kids chased each other on the street, rode their trikes, and giggled freely. There were fireworks afterwards. GFS is also a place to reimagine policing. You may or may not have heard about the numerous attempts to destroy murals at GFS. Every time that has happened, community leaders have handled that situation by engaging the person in conversation and then escorting them off the premises peacefully. Not a single incident was violent. GFS is a space where we talk things out instead of resorting to violence when it's not necessary. But as I mentioned earlier, GFS is a held space and community leaders mean that. There are meetings held twice a day, 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. to discuss plans for the memorial, debrief on events that have occurred or suspicious activity, discuss where leaders are in negotiations with City Council, including the Mayor, Jacob Frey, and even Governor Walz. Chicago Avenue is one of the longest and busiest roads in Minneapolis, and the city is losing a lot of revenue because that space is occupied. George Floyd Square, in many ways, is a bargaining chip that protesters have in talks with the government. There are currently 24 demands created by community members, and they refuse to leave that space until every last demand has been met. Marcia Howard, educator and unofficial mayor of George Floyd Square, spoke to a group of protesters about the significance of occupying GFS in this movement. Take a look.
So in meetings with City Council, with the mayor, they kept asking, what does justice look like? So we came up with Justice Resolution 001, a list of 24 demands specific to the Four Corners neighborhood. Four Corners, Powderhorn, Central, Bancroft, and Bryant. Y'all know that corner, 38th in Chicago. I done taught half the dudes in the alley. So when I go down the street, they say, hey, Miss Howard. I say, hey. They didn't count on that when they killed George Floyd, that they had Miss Howard, who is 36 steps from her front door to that barricade. And I can walk on the street, I can go down the block, I can walk into businesses, and we can go into the alley because we are forging community every day in every way that we can. And what we stand in solidarity on is that not only does community bring safety, but guess what will bring safety for everybody? Justice. If we thought we had justice, we wouldn't be burning shit down.
So as Marcia stated, relationships, community, and solidarity are what sustain this movement. Without intersectionality, this movement couldn't be half of what it is. BLM is a colorful movement with people from every imaginable community: Native and Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, white, LGBTQIA+, unhoused, the list goes on. There is a shared understanding that systemic racism hurts all of us, and the only way we can win is if we refuse to be divided and start to see ourselves in each other's struggles. For those who are not BIPOC, they recognize that this is primarily their work because they have benefited from the oppression of Black and Brown people for generations. All of the groups represented fight for each other, and people often identify as part of multiple different groups. Native Lives Matter has held events for men and women from their community who have been murdered by police, missing and murdered Indigenous women, and Indigenous Peoples Day. MIRAC an immigrants' rights group, has held events for families separated at ICE detention centers and for sterilization of immigrant women. The LGBTQIA+ community dedicated this year's Pride to Black trans women. The event was called Taking Back Pride, and they honored the contributions of Black trans women in the civil rights and LGBTQIA+ rights movement. In addition to organizing their own events, each of these groups has co-organized many other events for BLM, especially Native Lives Matter. Intersectionality has become increasingly important in one of the most divisive presidencies our nation has ever experienced. With the threat of rollbacks looming over so many marginalized groups and time-sensitive issues like climate change, it's never been more important for people to come together. The cadence of protest is fast and slow. It's loud and soft. It's sexy and mundane. It's a march and a vigil. It's holding the line and being pepper sprayed by police as your city's park department dismantles encampments created and sustained by the people without offering solutions to a housing crisis in the midst of a global pandemic. It's staying with friends when they're suicidal. It's community meetings to discuss police accountability, the city's management of George Floyd's murder, and action steps moving forward. It's taking the highways and burning it down when necessary. It's all of these things and so much more. In the words of Leela Watson, if you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you've come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. Thank you.